The truck had been running for 6 hours before Garrett Webb admitted he didn't know where he was going. Not lost. He knew exactly where he was, Route 11 southbound through the Shenandoah Valley, the kind of road that had been there long before the interstate and would be there long after. He knew the mile markers. He knew the exits. What he didn't know was why he was still driving at 3 in the morning or what he expected to find at the end of a road that didn't have one. In the back seat, Colt shifted his weight and exhaled that long, slow breath that German shepherds make when they've decided to stop worrying about something their human hasn't figured out yet. Garrett glanced in the rearview mirror. The dog's eyes caught the passing headlights for just a moment, amber and steady, then closed again. "Yeah," Garrett said quietly, "me too." The heater fan hummed. The tires read the asphalt in that low, continuous tone that sounds like white noise, if you listen long enough, like static from a radio station that stopped broadcasting years ago. Garrett had driven through worse conditions than this blackout roads in Kandahar mountain passes in Kunar province, where the drop on one side was 400 feet and the road was barely wider than the truck. This was nothing. This was Virginia in December. This was safe. That was the problem sometimes. Being safe. He'd left the apartment in Roanoke at 9 the previous evening with nothing in the bed of the truck except a duffel bag, Colt's food, and a sleeping bag he hadn't used since he was 23 years old. He hadn't told anyone he was leaving, partly because there wasn't anyone to tell, and partly because he wasn't sure he was leaving so much as just moving. The way water moves when there's nowhere left to pool. The VA therapist, Dr. Sylvester Crane, a careful man with wire-rimmed glasses who always set his coffee cup on the same corner of his desk, had told Garrett 6 months ago that avoidance was the enemy of recovery, that the brain needed to process, to revisit, to reconstruct narrative around trauma before it could begin to let it go. Garrett had nodded at the time. He was good at nodding. What he hadn't said, what he never said in those beige rooms with their motivational posters and their boxes of tissues placed just close enough to seem thoughtful, was that some things didn't need processing. Some things just needed distance. Not the soft kind of distance you got from breathing exercises and journaling prompts. The real kind. The kind you measured in miles. The gas gauge touched the bottom quarter just as the road curved west into Rockbridge County. He wasn't paying attention to it. He was watching the mountains on the horizon, the way they sat dark and enormous against the sky that was just beginning to think about morning, not committing to it yet, just considering the possibility. He had always liked that hour, 4 in the morning, the hour that belonged to no one. The low fuel light came on a small orange glow in the dashboard that he noticed only because Colt suddenly lifted his head. "I see it," Garrett said. He eased off the accelerator and let the truck coast toward the shoulder, looking for a station that he already knew wasn't going to be there. Out here between the small towns that appeared on maps but barely existed in practice, gas stations closed at 10 and opened at 6, and that was simply the way things were. He'd grown up in a place like this. He understood the logic of it, even if the timing was inconvenient. He pulled off onto a gravel road that forked away from the highway and let the truck roll to a stop. Killed the engine. In the sudden silence, the world outside was enormous. The wind moving through the pines in long waves, something far off, calling once and going quiet, the mountains holding their breath, the way mountains do in the deep of winter. Garrett sat with his hands still on the wheel. He was looking at the sign before he realized he was looking at it. It was small, the kind that real estate agents hammered into front yards, white with black lettering slightly crooked from a season or two of weather. It stood at the edge of the gravel road, half obscured by a cedar branch that had grown over it. The words caught the truck's parking lights just enough to read. "For sale, $58,000. Call Harlan Briggs." Garrett looked up from the sign toward the house. It sat maybe 200 feet back from the road behind a line of old oak trees that had gone bare for winter. 2 stories, white clapboard that had faded to the color of old bone. A porch that ran the full width of the front, its railing intact but leaning slightly to the left, as if the house had spent decades listening for something on that side. The windows were dark, the roof was sound. He could see that even in the low light, the lines clean, no visible sag. Chimney standing straight, it looked like a house that had been waiting. Not abandoned waiting. There was a difference, though. He couldn't have said right then what it was. He sat in the dark truck for 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock without meaning to. At 4:17, he took out his phone and dialed the number on the sign. It rang 9 times before a man picked up with the voice of someone who had been asleep and wasn't entirely sorry about it. Briggs, I'm sitting in front of the property on Carver Road, Garrett said. Off Route 11, the sign says 58,000. A pause. It does. I'd like to buy it. Another pause longer this time. Son, it's 4 in the morning. I know what time it is, Garrett said. I'll pay cash. Full asking price, I don't need an inspection. The silence on the other end had a particular quality to it, not reluctance, but something closer to relief, as if the man had been waiting a long time for someone to say exactly those words. I'll meet you at 9, Harlan Briggs said. Garrett slept in the truck, Colt pressed against the back of his seat through the gap between the headrests, warm and solid, and Garrett kept one hand raised until his fingers found the dog's neck. And like that, in the front seat of a cold truck, in the muck of a Virginia mountain road in front of a house he didn't know anything about, he slept without dreaming for the first time in longer than he could remember. The paperwork took 40 minutes. Harlan Briggs was a small man in his late 60s with a firm handshake and the particular efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste words. He didn't explain why the price was what it was. Garrett didn't ask. They sat in Briggs's car with the engine running for warmth and went through the documents with the quiet focus of two men who understood that some transactions were better conducted without excess conversation. When it was done, Briggs handed over the keys, 2 of them, on a plain steel ring. He started to say something, stopped, then said only, "It's a good solid house." Garrett nodded. He could feel the man wanted to say more, and he could feel just as clearly that he wasn't going to. He spent the first day doing what he always did in a new space, moving through it, slowly cataloging. Not decorating, not planning, just understanding the geometry of the place. Where the light came in the morning. Where the drafts entered through old window frames. Which floorboards held weight cleanly, and which ones spoke under pressure. The house was old, late 40s, he guessed, maybe early 50s, built by someone who understood timber and didn't cut corners on the framing. The rooms were modest but proportioned well. A kitchen with a cast iron sink, a sitting room with a stone fireplace that drew cleanly when he tested it with a match, 2 bedrooms on the main floor, a bathroom with original tile that had held up better than it had any right to. Colt moved Brahma through the house with the systematic focus of a Hmong who had been trained to clear rooms, and Garrett let him work. It was something they had in common, the need to know a space before relaxing inside it. The need to establish that there was nothing waiting behind the next corner before the shoulders could come down from where they lived somewhere up near the ears in the years since Trevor's. He didn't think about Trevor's on purpose. It just happened the way weather happened, not because you invited it, but because it was the kind of thing that moved through whether you were ready or not. Sergeant Dale Trevors, 31 years old, from a small town outside Bozeman, Montana, had a photograph of his daughter tucked into the band of his helmet, a little girl in a yellow raincoat, maybe 3 years old, holding a plastic bucket at the edge of a lake. Garrett had looked at that photograph so many times in the months after that he could reconstruct it now from memory with the precision of a man describing a crime scene, the way the light fell on the water behind her, the way her small fingers gripped the bucket handle, the precise angle of her smile. Trevors had been following Garrett's order. That was the whole of it. Garrett had given the order, and Trevors had followed it, and the order had been wrong by a margin of perhaps 6 seconds earlier, and they would have had cover 6 seconds later, and the angle would have been different, and instead, they were exactly in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and that was the entire architecture of what had happened. 6 seconds, a decision made under pressure, with incomplete information the way every decision in that environment was made. The inquiry had found nothing improper. His commanding officer had told him directly you couldn't have known. 3 separate therapists across 5 years had walked him through the logic, the probability, the fundamental impossibility of perfect foresight in combat conditions. He understood all of it. He had absorbed every word. And still in the quiet moments in the space between sleeping and waking in the long minutes at 4 in the morning, on an empty road, what he felt was not the complex theorized thing that grief was supposed to be. What he felt was simpler and heavier than that. He had given the order. Trevors had followed it. And Garrett was still here, and Trevors was not. He found the note on the second evening. He'd been moving a box of books into the sitting room, novels he'd carried from posting to posting and never read, accumulated over 15 years. The way soldiers accumulated things, not because they needed them, but because objects became anchors when everything else was in motion, when Colt stopped at the base of the staircase. Not froze, stopped. There was a distinction. Freezing was what prey animals did. What Colt did was something more deliberate, a complete and total arrest of movement. Every muscle system suspending simultaneously, ears lifted to full extension, eyes tracking upward with the focused intensity of a dog who had been trained to indicate, not react. Garrett set the box down slowly. He followed the dog's line of sight to the ceiling. Then as his eyes adjusted to the upper shadow of the stairwell, to the door above a narrow panel in the ceiling, at the top of the stairs, fitted with a short pull cord, an attic access. He hadn't noticed it on his walkthrough. He hadn't thought to look up. Taped to the door, the tape yellowed and brittle with age, the paper it held folded once along its center, was a note. He climbed the stairs. Colt did not follow. Up close, the note was written on lined paper torn from what had probably been a spiral notebook. The fold had weakened the paper along its crease, and the tape that held it to the door had long since lost most of its adhesion. It was the fold itself catching on the slight roughness of the painted wood that had kept it in place all these years. The handwriting was careful but unsteady, the handwriting of someone elderly or someone frightened, or both. Small letters slightly compressed as if the person writing had been trying to say something large in a very small space. 3 words. Don't open it. Garrett stood at the top of the stairs and read those 3 words for a long moment. He was not by nature or by training a superstitious man. He had walked through spaces that held the evidence of terrible things, rooms in foreign countries, where the walls told stories that no one had written down, corridors where the air still carried the residue of violence. He had learned to read environments to understand what spaces communicated beyond their visible surfaces. He had learned that places held history the way old wood held moisture, not visibly, not always, but persistently in ways that changed the structural properties of things. He took the note down gently, careful not to tear it further, folded it the way it had been folded, set it on the narrow shelf at the top of the stairs that must have once held a lamp or a small decoration, and went back downstairs. Not tonight, he said to Colt, though the dog was already in the kitchen, already looking at his bowl, with the patient resignation of an animal who had decided that dinner was a more manageable problem than whatever was happening at the top of the stairs. Garrett made food, ate standing at the counter, went to bed early. He woke at 2:17 with his heart moving fast and his hands searching for something that wasn't there. The room was dark and still. Colt was at the foot of the bed, sitting up, head raised toward the ceiling. The sound was directly above them. A slow drag. A pause, another drag. Irregular but rhythmic, not the random settling of old timber which Garrett had slept through 1,000 times in 1,000 buildings, but something with a pattern to it, something deliberate. The pause between the drag and the next drag was almost exactly the same length each time, like breathing, like rest between effort. Garrett lay still and listened. His body had done the automatic calculation, threat assessment, source triangulation, probable cause, and come back with nothing actionable. No indication of forced entry, no sound of weight on the staircase. The temperature in the room was unchanged, which ruled out an open window. Colt was alert, but not alarmed, ears up, watchful, not the low body posture the dog took when something was genuinely wrong. The sound came again. Drag. Pause. Garrett closed his eyes and let himself breathe slowly, deliberately, the way Crane had taught him, not because he believed in the technique as therapy, but because controlled breathing kept the body's systems from going to places they didn't need to go. He lay there with his eyes closed and his hands flat on the mattress, and he listened to the sound above him until it stopped. When it stopped, the silence was very clean. He didn't sleep again until morning. 3 more nights passed the same way. The sound always came between 2 and 3, always from the same direction above, and slightly to the left toward the far corner of whatever the attic space was. Garrett began to notice the way Colt responded to it, not with the sharp attention of a dog tracking a threat, but with something that looked, if he was being honest, almost like recognition. As if the dog had decided that whatever was making that sound was not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be acknowledged. On the 4th day in the gray mid-morning light, Garrett went through the house more carefully than he had the first time. He was looking for something specific without knowing what it was. He examined the fireplace, around the gaps between floorboards, the space under the stairs. He went through the kitchen cabinets and found nothing but old shelf paper and a rusted can of wood stain. It was Colt who found it. The dog had been following Garrett through the house at a comfortable distance, the professional courtesy of a working dog who understood that the human was searching and didn't want interference until they reached the main bedroom. Then something changed. Colt moved past Garrett purposefully and went to the far corner of the room where the wall met the floor beside the window that faced north. He sat down in front of that corner and looked back at Garrett. Then he began to dig. Not frantically, not with the wild energy of a dog chasing something exciting. With the focused, repetitive precision of an animal who had been trained to indicate the presence of something that needed a human's attention. One paw, then the other against the baseboard and the wall just above it. Garrett crossed the room and crouched beside him. Up close, he could see what Colt had sensed, a slight inconsistency in the wall surface. A rectangle perhaps 8 inches wide and 6 inches tall, where the paint had a different quality than the surrounding plaster, slightly smoother, applied over something rather than directly to the original material. Someone had patched this section and painted over the patch. The work was competent, the color matched close enough that he hadn't noticed it in his initial walkthrough. But Colt had found it anyway. Garrett pressed his palm flat against it. The surface gave slightly not the solid resistance of old plaster over lath, but the minor flecks of something thinner, something covering a space. He went to the truck and came back with a flat pry bar. Behind the patched section of wall in a hollow roughly the size of a shoebox, he found 2 things. The first was a bear, a small stuffed bear perhaps 8 inches tall. Brown fabric faded to a grayish tan, one of its button eyes replaced at some point with a slightly different size that gave it a permanently surprised expression. It had been placed in the hollow with its back against the far wall facing outward, as if watching the room through the plaster, as if keeping guard over something it couldn't see. The second was a piece of paper folded into quarters tucked beneath the bear's left arm, with the careful deliberateness of a child who has hidden something precious and wants to make sure it won't fall. Garrett unfolded it. The handwriting was a child's rounded letters, the kind that came from learning to write with concentration and effort, each character formed with individual attention. Some of the letters were slightly different sizes, the way they are when a child hasn't yet internalized the muscle memory of consistent proportion. A pencil, not a pen. The lead was still dark. His name is Bear. Keep him safe, please. Nora, age 6, Garrett read it twice. He turned it over, nothing on the back. He looked at the stuffed bear in his other hand, at its mismatched eyes and its faded fabric and its posture of permanent patient waiting. He thought about the hands that had placed it there, small hands pressing it into the dark behind the wall with the earnest seriousness that children brought to the things they believed in. He thought about the logic of it, the child's logic: if I put him somewhere safe, he will be safe. If I give him instructions, they will be followed. Colt pressed against his leg and stayed there. Garrett sat down on the floor of the bedroom. Not chose to sit down, but arrived there the way a man arrives when his legs have quietly made a decision his mind didn't catch in time. He sat with his back against the wall below the hollow, the bear in one hand and the note in the other, and the afternoon light came through the north-facing window in long, pale bars and moved slowly across the floor as the hours passed. He didn't think about anything in particular. That was the strange part of it, the part he would return to later trying to understand it. He didn't think about the attic door, or the sound above him at night, or the note with its 3 careful words. He didn't think about Trevor's, or the inquiry, or the 5 years of careful professional guidance that had moved the needle precisely nowhere. He didn't think about the apartment in Roanoke, or the truck outside, or the gas station 7 miles back down Route 11, where his life had taken a turn he still hadn't fully mapped. He thought about a child named Nora who was 6 years old, who had loved a small brown bear enough to hide him somewhere safe, who had written a note in careful pencil letters asking whoever found him to continue the work of keeping him safe. He thought somebody didn't come back for her. He thought she was waiting for someone who didn't come. And then he stopped thinking because Colt had laid his long head across Garrett's knee and closed his eyes, and the house was quiet around them. And outside, the Blue Ridge Mountains held the last of the December light against their ridgelines for a moment before letting it go. The note stayed on the shelf at the top of the stairs. Garrett didn't move it, didn't throw it away, didn't fold it smaller or tuck it somewhere out of sight. He left it exactly where he had placed it on the second evening, propped against the wall in the narrow shelf's shallow groove, and every time he passed the staircase he was aware of it, the way you were aware of a door left slightly open in a room you thought you'd closed. The bear he kept on the kitchen windowsill. That decision surprised him when he noticed he'd made it. He had set the bear there without thinking after carrying it downstairs on the evening he'd found it, and when he came into the kitchen the next morning and saw it sitting in the gray winter light with its mismatched eyes looking out toward the tree line, he considered moving it somewhere less visible and then didn't. It belonged in the light. That was the only explanation he had, and it was enough. The nights continued, always between 2 and 3, always the same slow drag from the far corner above his bedroom, the same measured pause, the same resumption. He had stopped lying tensed and calculating through it. Now he simply woke, registered the sound, and lay still, with his eyes open in the dark, listening with the particular quality of attention he had developed over 15 years of sleeping, in places where the sounds of the night mattered, not the reactive alertness of fear, but the still receiving awareness of a man trying to understand something that hadn't finished explaining itself yet. Colt sat up each time, ears raised, eyes on the ceiling, and then when the sound stopped, he settled back down with the deliberate patience of a Ahu who had decided that his job here was to witness rather than to act. On the 7th morning, Garrett pulled on his boots before dawn and went up the stairs. He stood at the top and looked at the attic door for a long time. The pull cord hung straight down in the cold air. The painted wood of the door was smooth except for one long, vertical crack near the left edge, where the house had shifted over the decades, the kind of crack that appeared in old timber, not from weakness, but from the slow, patient movement of a structure settling into the earth it was built on. He reached up and touched the cord. Then he let it go, went back downstairs and made coffee. He wasn't ready. He understood that about himself without judgment, the way he understood his own physical limitations. There were things you could push through and things that needed to be approached at the right angle, from the right distance, with the right preparation. Crane would have had a framework for this. Garrett simply called it knowing when to wait. He began to pay closer attention to the house itself. Not searching, he had done his searching, had moved through the rooms with systematic purpose in those first days, had noted and cataloged. What he did now was different. He sat in rooms and let them exist around him. He ate breakfast at the kitchen table and watched the morning light move across the floor. He spent an afternoon on the porch with Colt beside him, watching the tree line, not thinking about anything in particular, just occupying the space the way you had to occupy a space before it would tell you anything true about itself. It was on the 9th day that he noticed the floor. He'd been coming down the hall from the bathroom when the angle of the afternoon light lower, now coming in from the west window in the second bedroom at a shallow slant, caught the surface of the hallway floorboards differently than it did in the morning. He stopped walking, looked down. The scratches were not random. There were marks in the wood of the upstairs hallway floor, not the general wear of decades of foot traffic, which distributed itself evenly across the boards, but something more specific. A series of lines that ran from the center of the hallway toward the door of the second bedroom, not in a straight path, but in slight arcs, the way marks appeared when something was dragged rather than carried, when weight shifted unevenly, and the contact points changed angle. The marks were shallow, made by something with edges not sharp enough to cut the wood, but firm enough to compress its surface fibers over time. He followed them into the second bedroom. The room had been empty when he bought the house, empty of furniture, empty of the accumulated personal evidence of habitation. He had used it for storage, stacking boxes against the wall nearest the door and leaving the rest of the room to itself. Now he moved the boxes aside and crouched near the floor and looked at what the light was showing him. The marks continued across the bedroom floor, the same slight arcing pattern leading to the far corner of the room. And in that corner, sitting against the wall with a heaviness that suggested it had not been moved in a very long time, was a wooden chest. He had seen it before without registering. It had filed it away as part of the house's existing furniture, the kind of object old houses accumulated and held on to without particular purpose. It was perhaps 3 feet long and 2 feet deep, built from oak or something close to it, the surface worn smooth in the areas where hands had touched it over years, and rougher, where it had sat against walls and floors. A lock hung from the front hasp, heavy iron rusted to the color of old blood, the keyhole packed solid with the accumulation of years. Garrett straightened and looked at the chest. Colt had come into the room behind him and now stood at the threshold looking at the chest, with his head slightly lowered, not in submission, but in the focused forward-leaning posture the dog took when he was processing something complex. "I know," Garrett said. He left the chest where it was. The next morning, he drove into Lexington, the county seat 12 miles south, and went to the public library when it opened at 9. Not because he had decided to investigate. He told himself he was there for practical reasons. He needed a library card, needed access to the regional newspaper archive for information about the property's history, utility connections. That kind of thing. The kind of background knowledge any reasonable person would want about a house they'd bought. The librarian, a woman in her early 50s named Darlene, who wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain and moved through the stacks with proprietary confidence, set him up at the microfiche terminal without excessive commentary and pointed him toward the filing cabinet that held the archive index for the Rockbridge County Gazette going back to 1954. He started with 1985 and worked forward. Most of what he found was the ordinary texture of small county life school, board elections, agricultural reports, the opening and closing of small businesses, obituaries for people who had lived long lives and were mourned by specific names he didn't recognize. He moved through the years with steady patience, the way he moved through everything, not rushing toward what he might find, not dreading it either, just processing. He found it in the November 1991 archive. A small article, 4 paragraphs below the fold on page 3. The headline was plain and precise in the manner of local journalism: Rockbridge Girl 6 missing from County Road home. Below it, a photograph, a school picture, the kind taken against a blue gradient background. A small girl in a plaid dress looking at the camera with the slightly uncertain expression of a child who has been asked to smile for someone she doesn't know. Dark hair cut straight across the forehead. Eyes that were difficult to read in the poor resolution of the microfiche reproduction. Serious perhaps, or simply thoughtful. Nora Calvert, age 6, last seen by neighbors on the morning of November 14, 1991. Reported missing by her mother, Edith Calvert, upon returning from a night shift at the Shenandoah Textile Mill on the morning of November 15th. The home, a 2-story residence on Carver Road in the eastern section of the county, had been searched by sheriff's deputies and volunteer teams. No sign of the child had been found. Garrett read it twice. Then he wound forward through the following weeks. 3 more articles. The search expanded to include neighboring properties in a stretch of creek bed to the north. A tip about a vehicle seen on Carver Road that evening was investigated and cleared. By the 4th article, published in early December, the tone had shifted in the way that tone shifted in these situations, not abandonment, but a quiet recalibration of expectation. The investigation remained open. The family requested privacy. The community was thanked for its support. He found nothing after that. He drove back to the house in the early afternoon with the windows down, despite the cold, letting the air move through the truck cab with the particular force that 12 miles of mountain road at 50 miles an hour produced. He needed the cold. He needed the sensation of something immediate and physical to move against. Nora Calvert, age 6, November 1991. The same house. He had known something like this before he found it. He understood that about himself too, that his instincts processed information before his conscious mind caught up, that his body sometimes knew things in advance of his ability to articulate them. He had known since the note fell from the door and showed him the word please on its reverse side that whatever was held in this house was not simple and was not going to become simple by being ignored. He went upstairs, went to the 2nd bedroom, stood in front of the chest. Colt came and stood beside him. The lock was rusted solid, not dramatically, not in the way of props in films, but in the quiet, thorough way of iron that had been wet and dried and wet again over 32 winters until the mechanism inside had fused into a single corroded mass. Garrett examined it briefly, then went to the truck for a bolt cutter. The hasp gave on the 2nd attempt with a sound that was more of a deep click than a crack, the sound of metal that had forgotten how to move, suddenly remembering under pressure that it had no choice. He set the bolt cutter on the floor, opened the chest. The smell was what reached him first. Not decay, not the biological smell of something lost, but the specific atmosphere of enclosed space held unchanged for a very long time, stale and layered like the air inside an old book carrying the compressed residue of every season that had passed outside while this space remained sealed. Inside, blankets folded. Children's clothing also folded with a care and neatness that spoke of someone who folded things when they were frightened, who imposed order on small objects, when larger things were beyond ordering. Beneath the clothing in the bottom left corner of the chest, a stuffed bear, smaller than the one from the wall, white fabric gone gray with age, one ear stitched where it had begun to separate. And beneath the bear's right arm, pushed flat against the bottom of the chest, the edge of something red. Garrett reached in and drew it out carefully. A notebook. Small, the kind sold in drugstores for children. Red cardboard cover with a pattern of small, white stars. The spiral binding intact, the pages swollen slightly at the edges from old humidity, but otherwise preserved. On the cover, in the same rounded pencil handwriting he recognized from the note in the wall, Nora's book. Private. He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, and Colt pressed close to his right side, and he opened the notebook. The entries were not dated. They moved in the loose, nonlinear way of a child's interior life observations about the weather, about a bird she had watched from the upstairs window for 3 days and named Gerald, about a book her teacher had read aloud at school that she had liked very much and wanted to own. There were drawings interspersed with the writing, a horse, a house that looked like this house, a figure that appeared repeatedly throughout the pages, a tall person with a triangular body and lines extending from the head to suggest hair or possibly a hat. He read slowly. Midway through the notebook, the entries changed, not in handwriting, not in the careful print of each individual letter, but in subject and in feeling. The bird Gerald disappeared from the pages. The observations about weather became shorter. There were entries that consisted of only a few words. Today was bad. The loud man came again. Another mama doesn't know. I don't want to tell her because she will be sick. The loud man, he appeared in the entries without explanation or introduction, the way recurring figures appeared in children's writing, assumed as part of the shared context, not requiring establishment. He came when Edith Calvert was at her night shift. He knocked loudly, Nora wrote, and sometimes he didn't knock at all. He was not Gerald. He was not good. Garrett read these entries with his jaw set and his breathing steady, and the particular stillness that came over him when he encountered information he needed to hold very carefully. The last third of the notebook was where it changed again. Nora had found the chest. She called it her hiding castle in 3 separate entries. I found the hiding castle in the top room. It is big enough for me. I practice going inside. Then the hiding castle has a lock, but you can hold it open from inside if you are careful. Then written with slightly larger letters, as if the importance of the information required more space. If the loud man comes when Mama's gone, I will go to the hiding castle and wait. Bear will come with me. Nobody knows about the hiding castle except me. Garrett stopped reading. He looked at the chest across the room. Its open lid, its emptied interior. The folded clothes and the small white bear now resting on the floor beside it. He looked at it for a long time with the stillness of a man doing complex arithmetic in his head, and what he was calculating was not complex at all. It was simple. It was the simplest and most terrible equation he had ever run. A child who was afraid, a hiding place she believed was safe, a lock that could be held open from the inside until once it couldn't be, a night shift that kept a mother away until morning, a search that went through every room of the house without going up. Nobody knew about the hiding castle except Nora. He set the notebook down on the floor. Outside, the December afternoon was moving toward evening, the light going horizontal, and then amber, and then the deep, specific blue that came just before dark in the mountains, the color of something ending. He could hear the wind picking up in the oaks at the edge of the property, the dry branches moving against each other with a sound like distant applause or the turning of many pages. He had sat in rooms like this before, rooms where something irrevocable had happened, where the weight of what had occurred was still present in the air, distributed through the surfaces of things held in the grain of wood, and the texture of plaster, and the specific geometry of shadows and corners. He knew how to be in these rooms. He had learned it not through any formal education, but through the accumulated experience of being a man who had walked through aftermath and been required to function within it. What he hadn't learned, what 15 years of service and 5 years of therapy and Dr. Crane's careful coffee cup placement had not managed to teach him, was how to be in the room when the weight was his own, because it was his own. He understood that now, sitting on the floor of a second bedroom in a house in Rockbridge County, Virginia, with a child's notebook in his lap and 32 years of sealed air still moving through the room. The equation he kept running wasn't only about Nora. It had never been only about one thing. Trevor's had been following an order. Nora had been following her own child's logic of safety. Both of them had been in the dark waiting. Both of them had been somewhere that no one knew to look. And both of them had been left not by cruelty or indifference, but by the particular horror of ordinary circumstance, an order given 6 seconds too late, a search party that didn't think to look up. He had carried the weight of Trevor's for 8 years by telling himself a story about responsibility, about the specific gravity of command, about what it meant to send a man forward and have him not come back. It was a true story. He didn't dispute its truth. But sitting here in this room with this notebook, he understood for the first time that he had been telling only part of it. That he had been so focused on his own position and what happened on the order, on the decision, on the 6 seconds, that he had never fully inhabited the simpler, more devastating fact underneath all of it. Trevor's had been waiting too. In whatever darkness followed the moment of impact, there was a man who had trusted, and that trust had been the last thing he'd carried. Garrett pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He didn't make noise. He had never been a man who made noise in these moments, not from restraint, not from the performance of stoicism, but because what moved through him in the difficult moments was not the kind of thing that had a sound. It was deeper than sound. It moved through him the way water moved through rock slowly over years, finding the paths of least resistance and widening them with patient, irresistible force. He was crying without entirely knowing when he had started. The tears came down his face and fell onto the red cover of the notebook, and he didn't wipe them away. Colt shifted beside him, and then the dog did something Garrett had never seen him do in 5 years. Not when Garrett woke screaming at 3 a.m, not when the panic came in public spaces, and he had to find a wall to put his back against, not in any of the long bad nights in the Roanoke apartment when Colt had stayed close and warm and present. Instead of pressing against him, Colt stood up, walked across the room, and lay down directly in front of the open chest, his long body arranged along the floor before it, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes on Garrett, not offering comfort, not anchoring Garrett to the present moment, pointing. Garrett looked at the dog, looked at the chest, at the open lid, at the folded clothes in the small notebook, in the faded white bear arranged on the floor beside it. He understood what Colt was doing with the same bone-deep clarity with which he understood everything the dog communicated, not through analysis, but through the accumulated language of 5 years of operating together, of trusting each other in the places where language ran out. The chest was open. The notebook had been read. The hiding castle had given up what it had been holding for 32 years. Now someone needed to decide what to do with it. Garrett sat against the wall until it was fully dark outside. Then he got up. He went downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the small brown bear on the windowsill with its mismatched eyes and its patient expression. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, let the darkness outside thicken and settle. Let the house make its sounds around him. The settling of old timber, the movement of wind around the eaves, the ordinary nighttime conversation of a building that had been here a long time and intended to remain. The dragging sound did not come that night. He sat at the table until the coffee was gone, and then until the mug was cold, and then until the first gray suggestion of morning began at the eastern edge of the sky beyond the tree line. And when it was light enough to see clearly, he climbed the stairs, picked up the flashlight he had left on the shelf beside the old note, and continued up toward the attic door. The pull cord was cold against his fingers. Garrett stood at the top of the stairs with the flashlight in his left hand and the cord in his right and did not pull it. Not yet. He had learned over 15 years of walking into places that required care that the moment before entry mattered as much as the entry itself. That rushing forward was how you missed the thing that changed everything. That stillness in the right moment was not hesitation. It was preparation. He stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. The house was quiet around him in the particular way it was quiet in the early morning, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a specific kind of silence that had weight and texture that pressed gently against the eardrums, like the silence inside a church, or a hospital, or any place where people had felt things deeply, and the walls had absorbed it over time. Then he pulled the cord. The door swung down on its hinges with a long, low creak, the sound of wood that had not moved in years, suddenly remembering that movement was possible. A folding ladder came with it, aluminum, its joints stiff with cold and disuse. Garrett unfolded it one section at a time, testing each joint before trusting it with weight. Then he clicked on the flashlight, pointed it up into the dark rectangle above him, and climbed. The attic was smaller than he had expected. A low ceiling that peaked at perhaps 6 feet in the center and dropped sharply toward the eaves on either side, the rafters, exposed and strung with the remnants of old insulation that had compressed over the decades into something thin and inadequate. The floor was raw, plank-wide boards, the same timber as the rest of the house, dusty, with the particular fine-grade dust that accumulated in spaces where air moved very slowly over very long periods of time. He swept the flashlight beam across the space methodically, left to right, near to far. Old furniture covered with drop cloths, cardboard boxes sealed with tape that had dried and curled away from the cardboard, their contents unknown. A wooden chair with a broken back leaning against the far rafter. A standing lamp without a shade. The accumulated residue of a life that had continued after the house stopped being a home, objects brought up here to be out of the way, then forgotten, then left. At the far end in the corner, where the roof line was lowest, the drop cloths had been pushed aside or had slid from whatever was beneath them. The floor in that corner was clear, and in the center of that cleared space directly below the lowest point of the eave there was nothing. Just floor. Just the bare planks, dusty and undisturbed, with the faint gray morning light beginning to come through a small vent in the gable end and settle across them in a thin diffuse rectangle. Garrett stood in the center of the attic and moved his flashlight beam slowly across the floor. He was not looking for anything dramatic. He was looking for what was there. And what was there, when he looked carefully, was this: in the dust of the attic floor there were marks. Not the sharp, defined scratches he had seen on the bedroom floor below. These were softer impressions, rather than cuts, the kind left by something that had moved across a dusty surface with weight, but without hard edges. They led from the center of the attic toward the cleared corner, the same arcing pattern he had followed downstairs. And in the corner itself, the dust was disturbed in a rough circle, the kind of disturbance that resulted from something being placed there and shifted, placed and shifted over the course of a period of time long enough for the dust to settle between disturbances and be disturbed again. A small person, moving quietly, returning to the same corner. He stood in that corner for a long moment, crouched down, put his hand flat on the floor where the dust was most disturbed. The wood was cold, just wood, just a floor in an empty attic in an old house in Virginia. But he kept his hand there anyway, and he thought about Nora Calvert, who was 6 years old and called this space her hiding castle, and had come here when she was afraid, and he thought about the particular quality of courage that it took to be 6 years old and frightened, and to have a plan and to execute it, to fold your fear into something you could carry up a ladder and lock behind you. He had known men twice her age who couldn't do that. He stood up, looked around the attic one more time, then he climbed back down the ladder, folded it back into the door, and went downstairs to the kitchen. Colt was at his bowl. The small brown bear sat on the windowsill in the early light. Garrett made breakfast for the first time since he had moved in, actual breakfast, eggs and bread and coffee, with enough attention paid to the process that each element was done correctly and eaten at the table rather than standing over the counter. He ate slowly. He was thinking about the envelope. It had been sitting on the kitchen counter since the previous evening, when he had carried it up from the bedroom along with the notebook and the folded clothing and the small white bear, all of it arranged on the table before he thought better of it, and moved things to a less clinical arrangement. The envelope was small, the kind that came with greeting cards, off-white, the flap sealed with the dried residue of whatever adhesive a child had applied to it 32 years ago. On the front, in Nora's pencil handwriting, the letters slightly larger than in the notebook, formed with the extra care of something meant to be important. For the nice person who opens this. He had not opened it the night before. He understood why, without examining it too closely, some things needed the right hour, the right quality of light, the right degree of readiness in the person receiving them. He had waited for morning. Morning was right. He cleared the table, set the envelope in the center of it, sat down. Colt came and lay beneath the table, his warmth against Garrett's feet. Garrett picked up the envelope, worked the flap open carefully, the old adhesive releasing without tearing the paper. Inside was a single folded sheet, the same lined paper as the notebook, torn out cleanly. He unfolded it. It was not a letter. It was a drawing. Crayon on lined paper, the colors applied with the energetic imprecision of a child who was more interested in the image than the staying within any particular border. The image was simple: a house. This house recognizably with its full-width porch and its two front windows and the line of trees to the left. In front of the house, two figures. One tall, rendered in brown crayon with a triangular body and lines at the top of the head suggesting short, close-cropped hair. Beside the tall figure, a dog, four legs, pointed ears, a long body rendered in the confident, approximate way children drew animals they had observed carefully. The dog was brown with a darker brown along the back, which was as accurate a description of a German Shepherd's coloring as you could achieve with a limited crayon set. Above the house, a sun, yellow with radiating lines. Below the figure's green grass, despite the fact that Garrett had arrived in December, and the grass outside was brown and flat with frost. In the sky, to the right of the sun, in Nora's careful print, a sentence: "The good soldier will come when I am scared, and then everything will be okay." Garrett set the drawing down on the table. He looked at it for a long time. At the tall figure with its triangular body, at the dog, with its pointed ears and its German Shepherd coloring, at the yellow sun, in the green grass, in the words written in the sky, with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to doubt the things she believed in most completely. He was not a superstitious man. He had established this fact about himself years ago and had not revised it. He did not believe in the kinds of explanations that required the suspension of the physical laws he had spent his adult life operating within. He believed in what he could observe, what he could test, what held up under the pressure of examination. And yet, he looked at the dog beneath the table at Colt, who had come to him from a military K-9 program, who was brown with darker brown along the back, who had stood at the base of this staircase and refused to follow him up until the right moment, who had lain down in front of the chest when it was time for it to be opened, and then pointed silently and clearly at what needed to happen next. He looked at himself, at his own hands on the table, at the 15 years of service that had made him the particular shape of person he was, at the 8 years of carrying Trevor's, in the place where lighter men carried other things. A child had drawn this. A child who was 6 years old in November of 1991, who had hidden it in a chest in a corner of an attic, who had addressed it to the nice person who would open it, whoever that turned out to be. Whatever explanation made sense of that, he found he didn't need to choose one. He found he could hold the impossibility of it and the truth of it simultaneously without resolving the tension between them. He had learned in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the streets of Mosul, in the long, dark years of being a person who had sent a man forward and watched him not come back, that some things didn't resolve. That some things were simply both true at once, and the work was not to explain them, but to receive them. He was still sitting at the table when he heard the car, the sound of tires on the gravel road slowing, then stopping. A car door, then the sound of footsteps on the porch boards, unhurried, slightly effortful, the footsteps of someone old enough that each step required a small, private negotiation with the ground. A knock at the door. Colt raised his head but did not move from beneath the table. Garrett went to the door and opened it. She was perhaps 71, small and slightly stooped. Her white hair cut close against her head, her face carrying the specific economy of expression that came from a life that had required the conservation of feeling. She wore a dark coat over a wool sweater, sensible shoes, the practical clothes of a woman who dressed for function and had long ago made peace with that choice. Her eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses were the pale gray-green of river water in winter. She was looking at the bear on the windowsill. He hadn't moved it before answering the door. She could see it from where she stood over his shoulder in the window light. He watched her look at it with an expression that was not surprise and was not grief and was not relief, but was instead some specific compound of all three that didn't have a name he knew. "You opened it," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiness of a person who had prepared for this for a very long time. "Come in," Garrett said. Her name was Edith Calvert, and she had been living 2 miles east on the same road for 53 years, and she told him what she needed to tell him in the measured, linear way of someone who had organized the facts of a terrible thing over a long period of time until they could be spoken in order without collapsing under their own weight. She had worked the night shift at Shenandoah Textile since 1987. The mill was 12 miles south on the far side of Lexington, and on the night she worked, she left at 9, and returned between 6 and 7 in the morning, depending on the shift rotation. She had done this 3 or 4 nights a week for years because the night differential was better, and because it meant she was home during the day when Nora came back from school. Nora had known about the shifts. Nora had been a self-sufficient child, not unnaturally so. Not in a way that alarmed anyone, but in the way of children who grew up in houses where the adults worked hard and trusted them to manage the spaces between. She knew how to lock the doors. She had a neighbor's number written on a card by the phone. She had never, in 3 years of this arrangement, given Edith any reason for significant concern. The man Edith called her cousin Wallace had come into their lives in the spring of 1991. He was not a violent man. She said she wanted to be precise about this. He was a man with a drinking problem and a loose interpretation of boundaries, who arrived unannounced and let himself in with a key she had given him during a period of misguided family obligation, and had asked him to return and never quite confirmed that he had. She had not known he came when she was working. She had not known Nora was afraid of him. Nora had not told her. She didn't want to worry me, Edith said. She said it without self-reproach, or rather with a self-reproach so thoroughly incorporated into her way of being that it no longer read as an emotion distinct from the rest of her. It had become part of her posture, her voice, the particular angle at which she held her head. It had become structural. The morning of November 15th, she had come home to an empty house. She had checked every room. She had called the neighbor. She had called Wallace, who did not answer. She had called the sheriff's office at 7:45, and by 9 o'clock there were 4 deputies moving through the property. They had searched for 3 days. They had gone through the outbuildings and the creek bed and the tree line and the road shoulders for a half-mile in both directions. Wallace had been located in Staunton and interviewed and cleared. He had not been at the house that night, his alibi checked. There had been no evidence of forced entry, no evidence of an altercation, no evidence of anything except a child who was there and then was not. They had not searched the attic. The door was so small, Edith said, and it was taped shut. I had taped it shut 2 years before because the latch was broken and I didn't want her going up there alone. I told her not to go up there. The deputies saw the tape and assumed it hadn't been opened. She paused, folded her hands in her lap. She had been going up there for months, Edith said. She found a way to peel the tape back and restick it. I didn't know. Nobody knew. The search was suspended after 10 days. The case remained open in the technical sense that unsolved cases remained open, but the active investigation ended. Edith had continued to live in the house for 2 more years, though she could not afterwards say clearly why or how. Then she had moved to her mother's property down the road and closed the house, and eventually when her mother died, inherited the property and continued to own it without being able to enter it and without being able to sell it. She had found Nora in early December, after most of the official search was over, had gone back to the house alone one morning, and in the specific, exhausted clarity that followed weeks of crisis, had simply stood in the middle of the second floor and thought, where would she go? And had looked up. She did not describe what came after that in any detail. She said only that she had closed the chest, locked it, come downstairs, and written the note. That she had taped it to the attic door from the outside. That she had not been able to go back up. I've thought 1,000 times about opening it myself, she said. I've come to the house a dozen times with that intention. I get as far as the stairs. She looked at her hands. I couldn't be the one. I understood that about myself. I couldn't open it and find what she left there and survive it. I needed it to be someone who could receive it without it destroying them. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the December morning was clear and cold. The mountains visible in the distance with the particular sharp definition they had in cold air, every ridge distinct. She left something, Garrett said. It was not a question. I assumed she would. He got up and took the envelope from the counter where he had set it and brought it to the table and placed it in front of Edith. She looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then she reached out and took it with both hands, and he watched her read what was written on the front, and he watched what happened to her face when she read it. She made no sound. She simply pressed her lips together and nodded once slowly, with the weighted definitiveness of a woman confirming something she had needed confirmed for 32 years. He gave her as long as she needed. When she finally opened it and saw the drawing, She held it with both hands and looked at it the way you looked at something you had known existed without being certain, the way you looked at evidence for a thing you had believed on faith. Her breathing changed not dramatically, not in the way of a person breaking down, but in the small involuntary way of a person whose body was processing something that had bypassed the usual filters and gone directly to the place where the fundamental things lived. The tall one is the good soldier, she said after a while. Her voice was barely above a conversational volume. She talked about him. From about the middle of that year, she had a whole story about him. He was going to come when she was scared and make everything safe. She paused. I thought it was just something children did. Built a world where things worked out. Garrett looked at the drawing on the table between them. At the tall brown figure and the dog with pointed ears and the green grass under the winter sky. Maybe it was, he said. Edith looked at him over the drawing. He hadn't planned to say what he said next. It arrived in him the way the necessary things arrived, not decided but recognized. He had been carrying Trevor's for 8 years and had never spoken about it to anyone who wasn't paid to listen, anyone who didn't have a coffee cup and a notepad and the professional patience of someone whose job was to help him find a framework. He had never spoken about it to someone who simply knew in their own body what it was to have been too late. He told her about Trevor's in the same way she had told him about Nora, linearly, factually, without ornament. The deployment, the order, the 6 seconds, the inquiry. The way the weight of it had not decreased with time, but had instead become more familiar, like a fracture that had healed wrong, and no longer hurt acutely, but changed the way you move through everything. Edith listened the way she had spoken, with the concentrated receiving attention of someone who understood that the words being offered were not easy to give and should be held accordingly. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I tell you something? I believe you don't have to agree with it." "Go ahead." "I've spent 32 years believing that Nora's last hours were spent in terror, in darkness and cold and fear, waiting for someone who didn't come." She looked at the drawing, and then I read what she left in here, and I've had to reconsider that. She went up there with Bear. She had a plan. She was executing her plan. She believed the plan would work. She paused. Children that age, they don't have the cognitive architecture for hopelessness. She wasn't despairing. She was waiting. She thought it was going to work out. Garrett said nothing. "The people who don't come back," Edith said. She said it quietly, precisely, with the deliberate care of someone who had chosen each word over a long time. "They're not in the room where things went wrong. They're in the last room where things were still okay, where they still believed it was going to work out." She looked at him directly. "Your man, Trevor's. He was following your order because he trusted your order. That's where he was, not in the moment of the wrong, in the moment of the trust." Garrett looked at the table. The thing that moved through him then was not what he would have predicted. It was not relief. It was too large and too complicated for relief. It was not absolution, which he did not believe in and had not asked for. It was something older and simpler than either of those things. It was the sensation of a weight that had been in one position for so long that the body had built itself around it, finally shifting, not gone, not resolved, but repositioned, held differently, in a place where it did not change the way he moved through everything. He pressed his palms flat on the table and breathed. Colt came out from under the table and crossed the room and lay down in front of the kitchen window in the rectangle of cold morning light that came through the glass, and closed his eyes. The two of them sat at the table for a long time after that, not talking mostly. The way people who had said the necessary things sat together in the particular silence that followed the spending of words that had been held a long time, a silence that had a different quality than the silence before. Eventually they went upstairs together. Garrett carried the notebook and the small white bear and the drawing. Edith carried the brown bear from the windowsill. They went up the stairs and up the attic ladder, and in the cold and dusty space under the low rafters, in the thin December light coming through the gable vent, they put everything back. The folded clothing, the white bear, the notebook, and the drawing in its envelope, placed flat at the bottom with the flap unsealed and the words visible, "For the nice person who opens this." Edith added the brown bear, set it on top of everything with the careful attention of a woman who had been wanting to do this specific thing for 32 years and was going to do it right. She stood over the open chest for a moment. Garrett stood back near the attic ladder and gave her the space. Whatever she said to Nora then, she said in a voice below what he could hear, and he did not try to hear it. He looked instead at the far corner of the attic at the bare floor, where the dust was disturbed in its old patterns, where a child had come and gone and come again, until one night she hadn't gone. He looked at it with the same flat receiving attention he had given to every difficult space in his life, and what he felt standing in it was not the abstract obligation of secondhand grief, but something more immediate and more human than that. He felt the privilege of being the one who had come. Edith closed the chest gently. The old hinges received the lid without drama. Colt had come up the ladder behind them, had managed it with the focused, undignified effort of a large dog navigating a situation not designed for large dogs, and now lay down in front of the chest in the same posture he had taken downstairs, head on his front paws, eyes closed, his brown and darker brown body arranged along the dusty floor with a completeness of ease that Garrett had not seen in him since before the Roanoke years. He was simply resting. They left the attic door open when they came down. Garrett stood at the top of the stairs and looked up at the rectangle of pale light above him and decided with the specific, quiet certainty of decisions that didn't require deliberation that he would not close it. Not today, perhaps not at all. Edith came twice more before Christmas. They drank coffee on the porch and talked about ordinary things, the history of the county, the character of different winters, the behavior of the oaks along the property line that she had been watching for 50 years and could read with the accuracy of long familiarity. She asked him once what he planned to do with the house, and he said he wasn't sure, and she accepted that without pushing further because she was a woman who understood that some questions answered themselves in time. On Christmas morning, he woke before dawn to the silence of new snow 3 inches laid down overnight, in the particular hushed way that snow laid down when no wind was involved, each flake finding its place without interference. He lay in bed and listened to the silence of it, the total white absence of ordinary sound, and beside him, Colt breathed slowly and evenly in deep sleep. He lay there for a long time without moving, without thinking toward anything in particular, without the low-grade vigilance that had been his constant internal weather for 8 years, the permanent, exhausting readiness for the next difficult thing. He lay still and let the quiet of the house press against him on all sides, and what he noticed, what he paid attention to, with the full precision of a man accustomed to reading environments, was that the quiet was not empty. It was full. Full of the particular accumulated warmth of a house that had held many lives and many seasons and many long nights and was still standing. Full of the sound of Colt's breathing and the small settling voices of old timber and the far-off suggestion of wind in the mountain passes to the west. Full somewhere above him of the closed and open space of an attic where a child had believed absolutely in the arrival of something good and had left the evidence of that belief behind for whoever came next. He got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the snow. The small brown bear sat on the windowsill in its usual place. He had brought it back down after their visit not to reclaim it, but because the windowsill was where it had ended up, and the windowsill was where it belonged, and some things settled into their right positions without being arranged. Colt came and sat beside him. The snow covered everything in the same white patience. The oak trees, the gravel road, the long meadow to the east where the light was beginning, now very slowly to consider arriving. The note had said, "Don't open it." For 32 years, it had kept its word not to protect the house from the living, but to wait until someone arrived who was broken in exactly the right way to understand what was inside. Garrett picked up his coffee and stood at the window and watched the light come.